This series of short videos is sponsored by the Kentucky Rifle Foundation to share the knowledge and research of select Kentucky Rifle Association members. This video was filmed at the 2024 Contemporary Long Rifle Association annual show in Lexington, Kentucky.
My name's Art DeCamp. I've been a fairly long-time collector of Kentucky rifles, and one of the makers that I particularly admire is John Armstrong of Emmitsburg, Maryland, and we're going to talk about Armstrong rifles today.
What's a little bit of the history behind Armstrong and his work?
Well, Armstrong was born in the very southern part of Pennsylvania, about 8 miles from Emmitsburg, Maryland, in 1772. And according to census records, he was the head of his own household and apparently supporting himself by 1790. And at that time, he'd moved to Frederick County, Maryland, which is the county Emmitsburg is in. And he then worked from 1790 until his death in 1843, living in Emmitsburg, Maryland the entire time. He was one of the most highly revered artisans that made the Kentucky rifle. And through my interest that started in around 1980, I've been studying his rifles and looking at different characteristics of his pieces. For many years, I've been taking tracings, I've photographed, I've taken, read every article and book I could take, and in the last several years, I've actually been able to purchase and own some myself. And so I've been fascinated by his work for almost 50 years, I guess you'd have to say. Armstrong, compared to many of the other makers, first off, his rifles just have a certain artistic grace and fine appearance to them that stands out. If you were to put one of his rifles with 10 other Kentucky rifles, sooner or later your eye would be drawn to his as one of the outstanding rifles that are in that group, for instance. I think that has to do with the stock profile, and then beyond that, the detail work, and in terms of the carving and metal work that he did on inlays and patch boxes and butt plates. Every piece that he made from scratch to build his own rifles stand out above and beyond many of the other makers. He also prepared his own casting patterns and had the butt plate and trigger guards cast to his own design. He handmade his own locks throughout his entire working career, as opposed to buying shop or factory-made locks like many makers did. So the actual function and workings of his flint and later percussion locks are more precise and more carefully made. His inlays and engraving also stand out compared to other makers as being above the norm, as was the engineering approach that he used for actually constructing the rifle and creating a rifle that not only was pleasing to the eye, but also was functionally sound and stronger in several ways than other makers made. If you look at the rifle that I have in my hand here, this patch box is brass, of course. It's one of his more typical patch boxes. And one of the things that Armstrong did with his work is his rifles are very consistent in general appearance and profile, rifle to rifle and so on. His patch boxes, the decorative inlays that he put on rifles, also are very similar rifle to rifle. The engraving is always unique on each piece though, and every piece is slightly different, even though there's a strong consistency in the general appearance. And in my view, that's one of the hardest things as an artist or maker of rifles to do. It's easier to do something different and unique every time, but it's more difficult to maintain a high level of quality and also be consistent rifle after rifle. I think that Armstrong has been recognized by collectors and people that are fans of the Kentucky for many, many years. In fact, there's correspondence from the early 1900s from dealers that were selling Kentuckys in 1910, 114 years ago, that even then were highlighting Armstrong as one of the best makers that they had examples of for sale. So it's been, his work has always been highly regarded. His last apprentice was a gunmaker named Nathaniel Rowe, and Rowe lived, he lived in Emmitsburg and became Armstrong's apprentice when he was 15 years old in 1836. Rowe lived until 1915. He was interviewed by the local paper in 1908 and talks even then about Armstrong and how much he was known and thought of in the Emmitsburg area. So obviously his work was recognized as tops even when he was making his own rifles while he was still living. And we've found recent information that indicates that he actually died in June of 1843. We hadn't known his birth or his death date up until just some research that we did 2 years ago. So it's kind of neat to start to tie that together.
Right, you get that complete picture.
Yes, yes. But getting back to some of the functionality and some of the things that he did on his rifles, if you can start at the butt end of the rifle, many of his rifles have a steel insert right at the heel of the butt, which is where the rifle contacts the ground when one is loading it. And that actually acts as a wear plate that doesn't wear as quickly as the brass on the butt plate would. That's an extra step that he took to make that little high-grade insert in there that most makers didn't bother to do. Moving on up the rifle, while the rifle has a very straightforward and great functional profile, it also has a grace to it that draws your eye to the general appearance of the rifle. The tang screw that holds the barrel to the stock at the rear end of the breech end of the barrel is designed to go through the stock and then screws through the steel plate that holds the trigger underneath on the underside of the rifle. And he also engineered his butt plate or his trigger guard casting to actually hide the bottom of that screw with a little tab that sticks out. Many makers just have the raw screw sticking out the bottom that can snag on things and so on, and he had it thought out to how to make that both functional and strong, but also have it be out of the way and well thought out. His barrel keys that hold the barrel, the forestock to the barrel, were two-piece soldered pieces that have little rivets that hold the tab on the end, and he also slotted the barrel keys and then put a little piece of wire down through the wood to hold it in the stock, so when you removed the barrel, when you wanted to take the barrel out of the gun, the key would stay with the stock and not fall out and be lost. And most makers didn't bother to take those particular steps of care to do that. If you move clear up to the nose cap on the rifle, the nose cap is extra long to protect the end of the wood, but he also inset the front end of the nose cap so it's recessed into the brass as opposed to just being soldered on the end. Also a harder operation, a more difficult operation to do, but a much neater end result and a higher quality end result. In addition to the engineering design of the rifle that I've talked about, he also was a very fine artisan and craftsman in both his metal work and also his woodwork. The woodwork includes the incise and relief carving decorative that he put on each gun, and he had a very beautiful, slender, flowing design of carving that we'd put on the cheek piece side of the rifle. And the carving stands out as not being overdone, but it's just very neat and clean and delicately done. His metalwork, his engraving was expert on the inlays, like the cheek piece inlay with the typical American eagle and the shield on the cheek piece. Excellent engraver. If anything, I would say his metalworking skills exceeded his expert quality on his carving and woodwork skills. He handmade all the lock plates and internal lock pieces for his both flint and percussion rifles, and he decorated the outside of the plate and the hammer for the locks with engraving also, and had a beautiful flowing signature that he signed his name with on every rifle. Many of the rifles on the top flat of the barrel have the brass insert where he signed his name, and so he loved showing off the metalworking skills that he had.
As far as like census information, is there anything that talks about or describes what he did over the course of his life? Was he always a gunsmith, or did that ever change for him?
Well, based on the census information and also some more recently digitalized newspaper clippings that we've been able to dig up on him, it would appear that he was a gun maker from the beginning. When he was first head of the household when he was 18 years old in 1790, and he then married and had children. He had 3 sons and a daughter by his first wife, and the 3 sons all in one time or another either worked with him or became gun making employees at Harper's Ferry Arsenal. And one of the sons ended up, we think, in Washington, D.C. as a head armorer and at the arsenal in D.C. there. The daughter married a local Emmitsburg, Maryland man, and his family ran a foundry. So we're pretty sure that through that connection, that's where Armstrong had his castings cast, through his daughter's husband's family. And based on other information and touring that we've done, I'm pretty sure that I've stood right where Armstrong's grave is, next to his wife and his son-in-law, where they are also buried. So he lived his entire life in Emmitsburg, Maryland, or his entire adult life in Emmitsburg, Maryland. But it also looks like he probably dabbled in real estate some, because there's quite a few lots shown owned by him in the first decade of the 1800s, and he owned at least 2 houses during the course of his 50 years living in Emmitsburg. The second house he owned was on the same block as the foundry and his daughter's husband's family store and so on. So he lived, he was a business person in addition to being a gun maker. There's evidence in some of the literature that I've read where he also must have done actual door lock and hinge type work as a true locksmith, because there's records of receipts where he was paid for doing lock work by the Catholic monastery that was just a few miles south of Emmitsburg, and in the mid-1820s. And so he augmented the gun work by also doing other related skill metalwork type jobs. The other thing that we discovered through records that have come up recently are that, as I mentioned earlier, we didn't know a death date for him, and it was assumed that he had died around 1841, which was close, but we now know through a newspaper ad that was published in 1859 that he died in June of 1843, and they were trying to settle his estate 16 years after he died still. And they put a published notice, a legal notice that was published in the Emmitsburg paper, states that he died in June of 1843, and lists his offspring, his 3 older sons and his 1 daughter. And then it also lists the fact that he was married to a second wife and had a much younger daughter by that wife. And so we found out his entire family by the more recently digitalized records that we've been able to dig up. And we've kind of solved some of the mysteries about when the end of his life was, and how it happened, and so on. So, interesting stuff.
What has drawn you to Armstrong over 50 years? I mean, what keeps bringing you back to him?
I'll tell you a story about that. I got interested in the Kentucky rifle because my dad collected antique guns, and there have been a few Kentuckys in his collection over the years, and that was what drew me. That was the interest that I picked up. And I got the flu in 1980, and I was homesick from work for 3 days with a really bad flu. And that was the time I picked up the Kindig book, Thoughts on the Kentucky Rifle by Joe Kindig Jr., and started just leafing through it page by page as I started to feel a little better from this flu that I had. And when I got to page 493 in the Kindig book, there's the Armstrong section, and it was those rifles that day, looking at those, that I was drawn to and thought, wow, those are really nice. Those are the nicest looking ones of all of these in this big thick book, and the pictures in that book. And so starting with that episode, I then started going to various Kentucky rifle shows. I joined the Kentucky Rifle Association in 1984, and since then I've been trying to inhale and take in every bit of information on Armstrong that I could pull together. And I've probably seen 40 different rifles made by him and taken tracings and patterns from them. In my own personal contemporary rifle building experiences, I've made 8 or 9 copies of Armstrong's where I've tried to replicate his work as closely as I could. And so it's been a thing that consumed me for almost 45 years now.
What kind of resources should somebody seek out if they're interested in learning about Armstrong in the way that you have?
Well, when I first started being interested in Kentucky's, there were basically 3 books that you could get. There was the Kindig book on Thoughts of the Kentucky Rifle. There was the Dillon book that was published in 1924 that showed Kentucky's. And then there was the Merrill Lindsay book that had color pictures of the 2 Armstrongs that I have on display here today. And since then, so many other books have come along that it's become a lot easier to pull information in. There's a book by Dan Hartzler and Jim Whisker about Maryland long rifles that covers a good bit of biographical information and some good black and white photos of Armstrong pieces. And then there's a book published through George Shumway's company that Dan Hartzler also wrote about Maryland rifles that has a lot of tax and courthouse records relating to Armstrong. And those are the most easily accessible references that a person could get today and get their hands on those books with pictures. There are other articles that have been written over the years, and I did a seminar at the Kentucky Rifle Association 2 years ago with pictures and things that is unpublished at this point, but there are just various things through collectors, and auction catalogs is another good resource for looking through these. Both of these guns here have been in various auctions over the last 20 years, and so keeping those catalogs, you can go back and look at those pictures and see details that you wouldn't see otherwise.
Well, thank you very much, Art, and thank you for sharing your passion for the Armstrong rifle.
Thanks for inviting me, Ethan. It was my pleasure.
For more resources on collecting, research, high-quality photos, and more, visit KentuckyRifleFoundation.org. To get a taste of what the KRF offers with their extensive resource libraries, visit the Kentucky Rifle Foundation Facebook page. I'd like to extend a special thanks to the Kentucky Rifle Foundation for sponsoring this short series of videos. And special thanks to Art for his willingness to share his knowledge with you and future generations.